Well, we begin tonight with the news that the United States plans to pull out of a key nuclear weapons treaty, and they're blaming Russia, which is raising concerns that the move could lead to a new arms race. Now, here's a closer look at that treaty and why the U.S. may abandon what's been the centerpiece of arms control since the Cold War. The pact is called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty. It's been in place since 1987 and bans certain ground-launched cruise missiles. By May of 1991, just 3 years after it was ratified, 2,692 missiles were eliminated. The U.S. says it will pull out in 6 months because of a long unresolved dispute over Russian compliance.
To this day, Russia remains in material breach of its treaty obligations. We have raised Russia's non-compliance with Russian officials, including at the highest levels of government, more than 30 times. We provided Russia an ample window of time to mend its ways and for Russia to honor its commitment. Tomorrow that time runs out.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was quick to voice the alliance's support for the U.S. position. A NATO statement reads, "Allies regret that Russia, as part of its broader pattern of behavior, continues to deny its INF Treaty violation, refuses to provide any credible response toward returning to full and verifiable compliance. Unless Russia honors its INF Treaty obligations, Russia will bear sole responsibility for the end of the treaty." U.S. President Donald Trump also issued a statement blaming the Russians for the treaty's demise. "We cannot be the only country in the world unilaterally bound by this treaty or any other. We will move forward with developing our own military response options and will work with NATO and our other allies and partners to deny Russia any military advantage from its unlawful conduct." Russia denies violating the treaty, accusing the Americans of unilaterally seeking to neuter the treaty and of resisting Russian attempts to resolve the dispute. A top Russian foreign affairs official said, "I congratulate the whole world. The United States has taken another step towards its destruction today." But Russia was not the only factor in play. According to some experts, China's nuclear weapons capabilities and ambitions also played a role. U.S. officials have expressed worry that China, which is not party to the 1987 treaty, is gaining a significant military advantage in Asia. Well, joining us now from Washington to discuss the significance of a U.S. pullout are Thomas Countryman. Now, he's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation, and he's currently the chair of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. Hello, Thomas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me tonight.
And Behnam Ben Taleblu, he is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense and Democracies and one of the experts who says China was a major consideration for the U.S. in this decision. Hello, Behnam.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, Thomas, I would like to begin with you because my understanding is that you actually met with Russian arms control advocates in Moscow this week. Give us a sense of what their reaction is, how the Kremlin is reacting to the statements from the United States.
I was in Moscow earlier this week with a delegation of American NGOs, primarily to talk about another topic, but I was able to meet my former counterpart. I don't think there was anything surprising. They repeated the same things to me that they've said publicly, that the U.S. is not seriously seeking a solution to the problem, but only a unilateral surrender by Moscow. I pressed them on the proposal that has been put forward by a group of Russian, U.S., and German experts, former officials, to allow for a mutual inspection of the complaints that each side has about the others. That is, actually visiting the sites of the weapons that each are concerned about. I'm not sure that Russia is prepared to do that in a meaningful way, and the United States at this time rejects what it says is a false equivalence between a proven Russian violation and a speculative accusation by Moscow of a U.S. violation. So I can't tell you that I saw any signs of progress, but certainly the concern was shared by the Russian NGO community, by retired diplomats and generals like me, who are concerned about where this is going to go in the future.
Behnam, what do you think? What do you make of the U.S. statements in the first place and the subsequent Russian almost non-reaction?
Well, I think Russia is keeping its cards close to its chest right now. I think it's very important for them to watch the reactions within NATO over the next 6 months or the next 180 days here. I think the U.S. response by Secretary Pompeo was spot on. And if you look at it, the U.S. kind of bent over backwards, first giving the 60-day window, and then once the 60-day window expires tomorrow, beginning the countdown on that 180 days when the U.S. would no longer be bound by the INF Treaty.
You know, if you go back a couple of generations, this notion of an international arms race, particularly around nuclear weapons, that really sort of defined political narratives for so many countries around the world. And now, with this possible withdrawal of the United States from the INF Treaty, is there a possibility, Thomas, of a new arms race?
I think the immediate likelihood of a new arms race in Europe, one that replicates what happened between 1979 and 1987, when the U.S., NATO, and Russia, the Soviet Union, deployed more than 2,500 nuclear weapons in Europe. I think that will not happen immediately, but it is a risk in the medium term. I'm more concerned about what the U.S. decision today says about its overall commitment to arms control. If the New START treaty, which limits the more powerful long-range strategic nuclear missiles, is allowed to die in the next 2 years, then there will be no constraints whatsoever on either side's arsenal for the first time in 40 years, and then we will be off to the nuclear arms races.
Behnam, I can see you from my perspective shaking your head, or nodding your head, I should say. What stands out for you?
I think that's largely correct, and it's important to note here, if we do entertain something that is akin to an arms race, that there was a trigger for the arms race, and the trigger was the Russian incremental violations and the changes of the strategic environment by introducing that cruise missile, which did violate the INF Treaty prohibitions as of 2014 and into the present, fielding it, deploying it. I think it's very important for us to take a little bit of a broader perspective here and note that U.S. adversaries like Russia, like Iran, are looking to paint the U.S. as actually a bad actor, an unfaithful actor, where really the U.S. has been responding to provocations by these two rogue nuclear-powered or nuclear-inclined type of states. I think the Russians here are looking to make a pretty strong case about that the Americans cannot be trusted, and that's why you had comments by the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia today holding New START, which was just mentioned, hostage. I think it's imperative that New START do be renewed to keep some kind of bounded strategic competition between Russia and the United States, but it's important to know where the blame lies. And it's in fact more important to know that the NATO alliance came out fully supporting the American position on this, which was the predicate for the withdrawal.
Well, I wanted to address that next. So at what point, so right now NATO is backing the United States, not surprisingly, but will they continue to do so? Are we going to see other countries fall in line with the U.S.?
Well, I think it's quite important that NATO did not automatically or in a knee-jerk fashion default to this position, which it issued its full support to the United States. You know, there are many issues in the transatlantic alliance right now, be it Iran sanctions, Russia sanctions, energy, the environment, NATO funding, that actually have created some distance between the NATO alliance or continental Europe or even the EU and the United States. So I think it's really great that the administration laid the diplomatic groundwork here and was able to bring or bridge the transatlantic alliance, keeping this alliance unified in the next 6 months, preventing the Russians from poking and prodding at it, trying to create any cleavages through pressure, cyber attacks, or even different deployments is going to be crucial.
What do you say, Thomas?
Well, a couple of points. First, I don't ever enjoy the blame game, and the fact that Washington and Moscow are now deeply into this game is of concern. You can talk about fairness, you can talk about blame. What I would hope to see from both leaders is a little more wisdom, a little more concern about security and about reducing the ever-present risk of mutual destruction of our two countries. On NATO, I think it is important that NATO supports the viewpoint that Russia is in violation. It is a fact, and that Russia has to take steps. After all, this new weapon system is not aimed at North America. It is aimed squarely at Europe. And I wish that the Europeans perhaps would have done more before today to press Russia on this point. While there's unity today, there are a lot of questions about the next steps in security, diplomatic steps and military steps that NATO must take. and it is by no means certain that any of the NATO allies would like to see new U.S. nuclear missiles deployed on their territory.
When you say there's a lot of questions, give me the follow-up to that. What are the questions? What are your concerns?
Well, my concern is that, yes, Russia has sought to gain additional leverage and military advantage over the NATO alliance. This is not the most important part of their arsenal, but it should be responded to in an appropriate way if Russia does not remove these offending missiles. The best way to do that is not by reciprocating with exactly the same tactics of deploying U.S. nuclear missiles in Western Europe, but there is potential, even if the treaty is abandoned by Washington, to have additional agreements between the U.S., NATO, and the Russian Federation that could limit the deployment, could ensure that none of these missiles are nuclear tipped. There are additional options to explore if we are unable to preserve the treaty as it is.
Behnam, I want to move on to another issue with you, which is we've talked about these two major powers, the United States and Russia. We're talking about NATO, we're talking about the Europeans, but there's also the issue, the looming issue of China. And my understanding is that the rising military threat from that Asian nation is part of the decision by the United States also to withdraw from the INF. Explain that to us.
I don't know if it's part of the immediate decision that the United States took. If anything, I think the immediate decision was triggered by the grossness of the Russian violation and the ability to actual marshal unity in NATO. But it is part of the larger strategic rationale for the withdrawal. We know this administration has put a lot of emphasis on countering China almost in every single domain: economic, cyber, military, political power even. And I think having a response to the growing Chinese cruise and ballistic missile threat in the Asia-Pacific, missiles which actually do qualify to be prohibited had China been part of the INF, which obviously they weren't, means that the U.S. in countering China would be fighting with one arm basically voluntarily tied behind its back. It does free the U.S. up for conventional options there. It does free the U.S. up for more creative options to offset growing Chinese military capabilities. But at present, the focus should be on making sure that we can cajole the Russians back into compliance. It seems like that's going to be unlikely in the next 6 months, but perhaps introducing some dynamics of risk there could change the Russian calculus.
Okay, Thomas, quick final word to you.
Well, what concerns me in the long run is the hostility displayed by the U.S. National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, towards a whole series of arms control agreements. And he's been involved in the demise of 4 key agreements over the last 20 years. He has expressed in the past his hostility towards the New START agreement. And even though the State Department, the military, the intelligence agencies favor extension of New START within the next 2 years, it is opposed by Mr. Bolton. Whether we can get to a step that makes perfect sense for U.S. national security, for the security of our allies, and for the peace of the world, and extend that treaty remains to be seen.
Okay, we will leave it there, and certainly the world will continue to watch. Thank you both for your time today.
Thank you.
Thomas Countryman and Behnam Ben Taleblu, both joining us from Washington this evening.